Hello, hello.
Hey,
Welcome
Belinda.
to Hey, Nicole. Welcome to another new moon. It's another month
Yes,
and we have another new moon. And
it
this
keeps coming
one,
back.
I know, every 28 days
Yep.
and a few hours. It's pretty magical that we have this cycle to kind of
Yeah,
sink back into, but every time it shows up in a different way with its iteration, right? So
yeah,
this time we have new moon in Leo, which is a completely different energy than the moon in Cancer that we had last time,
for
right?
sure. Yep.
So a little introduction. I'm Belinda. I am an astrologer here in Los Angeles. I use astrology as a symbolic language to talk about some energies that my clients might be feeling, ways for them to understand themselves in a deeper way, and to really understand events that are happening around them as well.
Yeah, and I'm Nicole. I work with the tarot, and I work with the tarot, helping my clients understand these archetypal energies that are already within them. And when we do that, it helps us better understand ourselves and helps us become more whole, more fully integrated, rather than, you know, compartmentalized and sort of fractured. It allows us to bring the pieces together and be, on a more coherent path, or a path that feels more aligned to our spirit.
Yes. Nicole and I are working together to bring astrology and tarot to enrich the tools that we have to talk about these energies that we're feeling. It's really amazing because maybe if something doesn't resonate with you with the astrology or with the tarot, there's so many other ways to understand these complex energies. And so take what you can from this conversation, take what resonates for you and speaks to you. And it's amazing to be able to have this sort of collaboration where we have two complementary and different styles of approaching something like this, right?
Yeah, yeah. And one thing that I love about the symbolic language of astrology, the archetypal language of the tarot, is they really speak to us on an unconscious level. And so it allows us to do a deeper healing when we start to understand how these energies are working on that more hidden
Yeah.
layer.
Yeah, the power with tarot is that you have imagery that you
Yeah.
can really, it has the whole visual element, and there's a visual element to astrology too, but it is, you have to learn how to read the map, right? There's a lot of technical aspects of it. For me, I feel like it's a map that I'm like trying to figure out, okay, so this path is connected to here and this is connected to here, but in lots of ways it is very intricate, whereas the imagery within the tarot cards sometimes can have a much more immediate reaction, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
intuitive sort of process there, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I love to teach people how to read the tarot because you don't have to have as much technical knowledge as you do with astrology. You can literally look at the cards and ask yourself, what is this saying to me? Because it is very personal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna pop up the astrology chart so you all can kind of see what I'm talking about in terms of the complexity of trying to read what an astrology wheel looks like, right? So looking at this versus looking at an image of the tarot card is completely different. But basically what we have is a snapshot of the sky during the new moon. So the new moon is happening on August 16th at 2:37 a.m. in Los Angeles. So this is Pacific time. And what is happening with the new moon is the moon is conjunct or exactly in front of the sun. So they're going to both be at 23 degrees in Leo during this time. Okay. And just to point out a couple different aspects that are happening, and I'll go more into aspects a little bit later on. The primary one that's going to cause probably a little bit of tension during this time is the sun and the moon are making a square with Uranus, which is exactly at 23 degrees also. So I'll go into that more a little bit later. All right. So let's see. So when we're talking about the new moon, And we've talked about this before. We're talking about a phase of the moon. We're talking about the symbology of the moon. And now we're talking about the new moon in Leo, which is adding the zodiac sign, right? So anytime we're talking about astrology, we're kind of talking about three different components. We're talking about the planet, we're talking about the zodiac sign, and then we're also talking about the house, which we'll go into when we talk about our charts. When you're thinking about the planets, you're kind of thinking about the characters in the play. Okay. When you're thinking about the zodiac sign, you're thinking about how they're performing. What is the energy that this character is embodying? Okay. When you're thinking about the house, you're thinking about the set that this is all taking place in. All right. So Leo, when we talk about its rulership, it's ruled by the sun, which means Leo feels most at home, or the sun feels most at home in Leo. So Leo already has this energy that is very vibrant. Leo has this energy of producing light. And it's also symbolized by the image of the lion. So it also connotates this idea of fierceness, this idea of courage and bravery. Leo is also a fixed sign. So what that means is it likes to keep a level of constancy. Oftentimes, Leo can be associated with loyalty. There is a sense of, I will defend myself. I will defend anyone that I love. And that really comes out in its fixedness. There's also an idea, because it's a fixed sign, it doesn't really want to change a lot. When you think about the sun, the sun never changes, right? The sun is the constant force. And so that idea of the fixed element of the energy imbues itself in Leo. Also, it's a fire element. Anytime you have fire, there is a sense of change that's happening, right? Fire is both creation and destruction. So there's this immense amount of power that can happen during this time. It's also directive energy, or could otherwise be known as a masculine energy, which just basically means that energy is moving outwards. Energy is being shown out rather than coming back in internally, introspectively. Leo is also associated with the heart chakra. So it has a lot to do with generosity and compassion. And Nicole's going to go more into that a little bit later. Some keywords that you want to be thinking about when you want to tap into this energy of Leo is, how are things, what is your identity attached to? How is your purpose changing? How can you express your sense of play and pleasure? How can you connect with your creative force or your sacral energy? What gives you vitality? And how can you own your own authenticity? How are you radiating out into the world and taking leadership within aspects of your life? And because this is a new moon as well, we're thinking about beginnings of things, and things are starting out. So this is a great time, actually right before the new moon is a great time for you to reassess how am I going to set my intentions, so that when the new moon actually does come, you can start to take steps in those parts in your life. Now, when you're thinking about the shadow side of Leo, when you go a little bit too far in that Leo energy, when you're thinking about the sun that's shining a little bit too much, maybe blinding you, what is it actually hiding in that moment, right? So the shadow side is literally the shadow that is hiding during that time, right? How are you covering up what really needs to be healed? How can you really shine the light more effectively on those aspects of you that really need attention, rather than increasing the brightness for the areas that are maybe a little bit more comfortable, maybe a little bit more performative, maybe a little bit more flashy, right? And that can be sometimes hard to balance within Leo energy. Nicole, I'm going to turn this over to you. I'm sure you have a lot to say here.
Okay, yeah. It's so interesting. This is one of the cards where there's a lot of similarities between Leo and the actual strength card. So the strength card is what represents Leo. The high priestess is what represents the moon. And when I think about the high priestess, she is really the initiator into the mysteries. So when we think about the new moon, this is a phase where something is being shown to us by the high priestess, some mystery about ourselves most of the time that we're being initiated into with the new moon. And so because the new moon is in Leo, um, the mystery is going to be around our sense of strength and what it is that gives us strength. So the strength card really represents, we see this woman who has this lion tamed. She is working with this lion. So it's not like she's necessarily dominating it, but she's working with it. And what this represents is us understanding how to work with our animal instincts, our more wild side, our instinctual nature. And you can see she herself, she's, decorated in these garlands. She's very earthy herself, but she is, because she has figured out how to work with this wilder instinctual energy, she really becomes more integrated. And this is where her strength or her power comes from. It's an inner power. It's not necessarily about domination or brutal force. It's about that strength that comes from within when we are coming from the heart and coming from our more whole selves. And so strength, another word for strength is courage. And the word courage comes from a French word, cœur, which means the heart. And so this is really about coming from the heart. That is where our power is, and really understanding how the power of what it is to work with our hearts, especially in our culture where we're, conditioned to be rational and think about the mind. This is the part of us we gain strength from coming from the heart. And like Leo, it is a very creative energy. The heart is a very creative force. I can't remember how much it is, but the heart has like a magnetic field that is larger than any other part of the body. I think it extends like 3 to 5 feet out around us. So it's a really powerful, creative energy. So we're getting this glimpse into this part of ourselves, like where can we engage more or work with our wild instinctual selves? Because we are taught mostly in this culture to sort of shove it aside. It's not proper, it's not civilized, but it has a purpose. It is part of us. And so this is a time to think about how we can integrate that more in our lives and use it as a force of strength by working with it.
I really, really love that, because what really comes through is when the Leo energy is overpowering, it's really leaning into this sense of ego. And what better way to combat ego than to soften the heart, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so that heart work really is, it seems, the heart work is really creating space for there to be room for someone other than yourself, right? I think Leo can be a very self-centered energy sometimes, and the heart doesn't have any sort of limitations in that way.
Yeah.
Ultimately, learning to love other people and receiving love from other people, especially, you're learning how to love yourself too. And I think that's the medicine there.
That's a big part of it. Yeah. When I think about that heart work, a lot of it is about having compassion for others and for yourself.
Yeah. Let's maybe bring the square to Uranus that's happening, because it is making a direct aspect to that. And so anytime we're talking about aspects, everyone, we're talking about relationships, conversations that planets are having in the skies of each other. So when I'm looking at the map, I'm looking at what kind of angles these planets are making with each other. So the square is the most tense aspect. It can be the most conflict ridden. It can be sometimes the most difficult process. And Uranus itself is an energy that is pretty, I don't want to say volatile. Maybe a better word for Uranus is just like it is unexpected. It just comes out of nowhere, and it is not subtle, right? And I think we've talked about Uranus quite a few more times like before this as well. And so when I think about Uranus making a square with the moon, which is also making a square with the sun because the moon and the sun are together, I think about Uranus and the sun having a fight over the egos. These are pretty powerful energies. Uranus is oftentimes associated with the archetype of Prometheus. And so when you think about Prometheus and you're thinking about this big ego sun, there is just two giants that are fighting right here. Who knows what's going to happen? And so there's this sense of there's going to be an ego death. Someone's going to emerge out the winner. And then you throw the moon into there. This moon that is associated with your inner world of perhaps your spiritual world, your soul, sometimes your emotional inner workings, sometimes your physical body. It's very personal. The moon is a very personal energy and a very feminine energy. And you throw that into that ego death fight, and all of a sudden there's more flow that's happening. She asks, hey, how can we have a little bit more flow? And so there's a sense of surrendering too, leaning into that surrender of maybe I don't have to fight this ego death so hard, right? I'd love to hear what you have for the card here.
So Uranus is represented by the Fool in the tarot, and the Fool is really about, it's very interesting because there's a few cards like this in the tarot, but there is a human on the card as well as an animal. And so there really is this connection about what is your relationship to your instinctual self, your wild self. And with the Fool, he's kind of just going along. The dog is even pushing him a little bit, maybe off of this cliff. So he doesn't necessarily have the control that you have with the Strength card, where she is really working with strength. She's managing it. She's tamed this. But with the Fool, he's going to come in and be, you know what, we need to get a little more wild, maybe a little more risky here. So that can really upset that balance that's created with strength. So I can see how that tension can really be sort of confusing. Like, you think you've got it all together, but then something comes in to disrupt all of that. And that is the Fool, who really wants you to just, go with what's happening, to trust what's coming up in your life, even if it feels like you're about to step off a cliff like he is, and really just trust that this is all happening for your highest good.
I love that. It's so amazing how the cards and the astrology really do complement each other and just add so much depth and meaning to everything.
Yeah.
So what I'd like to bring in right now are some rituals that could be helpful during this time, where you might feel a little bit of tension that's happening with the Leo energy. You might feel a little bit of tension from Uranus, where things are just kind of sidelining you unexpectedly. And so some things that were really coming to me were this process of alchemizing, when you really turn one thing into something that's completely different, and alchemizing specifically through fire. And so something that could be really therapeutic during this time is cooking. You're literally spending time on raw ingredients and creating something that is a cohesive, that completely changes the ingredients. All of a sudden it adds complexity. All of a sudden there's a sense of collaboration within the ingredients. And so whether that's cooking a nice meal for yourself, or having some friends over, or cooking for a partner, whatever it means, baking, that's great too. If you're not into cooking, you're more into baking, that's completely fine. But alchemizing through fire, where something goes into the pot and something comes out completely different. Another idea that was coming to mind.
Oh, wait, I just want to add to that, because as you were saying that, I just thought it would be so funny, because we're talking so much about instinctual. Maybe it's cooking without a recipe and not caring if it turns out, but just being with the experiment and following your heart and seeing what happens.
I love that. I love that. Really just really letting yourself play, which is very much of the Leo energy, letting yourself give into whatever comes out through my intuition, through my creative force.
Yeah.
So I love that. Another idea that kind of came to mind was gathering around a bonfire. If you're feeling a little bit more social during this time, circling around a fire, the symbolism of that, something that provides heat, something that provides community, something that provides life force, and being able to gather around that, whether you're going camping or you're by the beach or something like that, or in the backyard, a sense of community within a bonfire, I think, is a really powerful ritual.
I love that.
So a few other things come to mind too. With Leo, I think a lot about mirror work because there's so much focus on the self and how do you have a conversation with yourself. Mirror work is a really interesting process because we don't end up talking to ourselves while looking at ourselves. Sometimes we're journaling or we're voice memoing or whatever our tools are, but having to actually confront yourself the way that someone else would it can be a very foreign process, right? So in leaning into the heart energy, perhaps a good exercise could be writing yourself a love letter and reciting it to yourself in the mirror. Make eye contact with yourself. Might be very uncomfortable. It adds a whole different experience to that love letter writing process where you have to actually express it to yourself and say it to yourself and receive it all at the same time. So I find that mirror work is really powerful with Leo energy too.
Wow, I love that. And yeah, I mean, it takes a lot of strength to do that too, to receive that love from yourself. We're so not used to it.
I mean, vulnerability is
Yeah.
that takes massive strength, right? That takes
Yeah.
so much courage. So really being able to be vulnerable with yourself, I think, is something that's really potent during this time. Another really powerful tool and magic during this time is sex. And so sex is a great tool for alchemizing energy. And it doesn't have to be sex with another person, sex with yourself, self love. If you even want to combine this with mirror work, that is adding a whole different degree of alchemizing and acknowledging and vulnerability. But there's a lot of creative energy that comes into play. I know some people that will do a lot of abundance work, abundance manifestation through self-pleasure. And so really tapping into that and allowing yourself to receive pleasure, that's very, very in tune with Leo too.
Yeah, I love that.
And if you're looking for a journal prompt during this time, I think being able to assess prior to the new moon, which fires in your life do you want to continue to stoke and add fuel to? What do you want to continue? Which fires do you want to grow? And then by contrast, because we have limited energy, also thinking about which fires you'd like to douse and put out, which fires are no longer worth your energy to sustain. And I think that will help set you up for this new moon and taking new steps forward, really being able to assess things that let go. I think that's always really powerful during the dark moon and then going into the new moon, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Great. I love those.
Awesome. So what we're going to delve into right now is just a little bit of chart work. So what I mean by that is I'm going to talk a little bit about Nicole's chart. I'm going to talk a little bit about my chart, and you're going to see how specific these energies, we talk about the new moon in Leo, not everything that we said might resonate with you. You might not even feel any of these energies during the new moon. It's because we all individually have different charts. Some of the energies might affect us differently than the next person. So we're going to get even more specific here and talk about how things could potentially manifest for each of us, just so you start to get a glimpse of the layers of understanding that go into astrology and tarot. Okay. So Nicole, your rising sign is Leo. So that means the rising sign is also known as the ascendant. If you ever hear anyone talk about their ascendant, it's also your first house. So that house is very much associated with identity as well, and your physicality. And I like to think about the rising or ascendant sign as how you're showing up in the world, how you're being birthed into the world. So some people associate that with first impressions. Some people associate that with how you approach life. So all of this happening in your first house for you, with also Venus retrograde in Leo happening at the same time, there's this sense of self-definition that is evolving right now. There's the sense of what anything that ever happens in the first house, there are some real foundational changes. So I'm going to be very interested in seeing what happens, how you emerge on the other side of the Venus retrograde, especially, and then also how this new moon impacts you in your first house. So a few different aspects that happen for Nicole, okay? It squares her natal Saturn. It also squares her natal Neptune. And like I mentioned before, squares are sometimes really tense conversations. Now, when we talk about Saturn likes to put limitations on things, right? So when you have the moon and Saturn in a square, Saturn is saying, hey, I need you to slow down. Hey, I don't think that we need to make sure that this is long lasting change. And so it is really kind of imposing in lots of ways. Saturn can be very imposing. Sometimes it can be a little bit of a drag. And it's to understand Saturn, I believe that Saturn really sets us up for mastery. So when we feel boundaries, when we feel stuck with certain things because of Saturn, usually it's the time to assess, well, why am I being asked to slow down during this time? Why are these roadblocks here? And maybe you might not be able to see that until much later on, but oftentimes the timing of that is usually for a reason, right? Now, on the other side of things, you have the square with Neptune, which Neptune is saying, hey, let's go, catch some fairies and get lost in the forest. And why don't we just float away into this other world? And so it's really interesting energy because you have a square with both Saturn and Neptune. And I imagine for you, that is a very interesting energy to feel like both forces, which are very, very different energies, might feel very conflicting at times. And you might feel a sense of struggle of, I want to go play and do all the things and let go. And also, why can't I? I feel burdened way. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting. As you know, there is a lot going on in my life right now. And so I am really feeling this energy. But let me just talk about in general, so the Saturn represents the World Tarot card. And, similar to what you were saying about Saturn, it really is all about our limitations. We see this woman who is limited by this wreath that's around her. But this is a wreath of reality. This is when we reach the world, or when we're working with the world, we're understanding how to work with our limitations in a way that allows us to become more of who we are. We see at the center of this wreath, this woman, she's naked. She is fully in her skin. She is owning herself. She is dancing. So she's really kind of got it all figured out. But it's only because she has figured out how to work within her limitations. And I think this is such a fascinating card. We hear so much in our culture about how, in the coaching culture, you are limitless. And to some extent, that's true, but we're also limited. And it's really important for us to remember that. And Saturn, or the world, I think is probably really good at helping us remember that.
I love you with your earthy energy. That's like, okay, reality check, everyone. We do have limits. Love it.
And then we've got Neptune. So Neptune is represented by the Hanged Man. And the Hanged Man is really all about sacrificing yourself for your values. And it's a really uncomfortable card. I mean, who wants to be hanging from a tree by 1 foot? But this figure also has a halo around his head because he knows that these sacrifices are all, they're part of his spiritual path. So even though it's uncomfortable, he's really kind of calm and just like in acceptance. Okay, this is what needs to happen right now. It's uncomfortable, but I know it's important for me to do this. And, this is really similar to a lot of what's going on in my life right now. There's a lot of things that I'd rather be pursuing, like catching fairies, or I'm really interested in doing a lot of lucid dreaming stuff, but I've had a lot of real stuff going on in my life with my family, a lot of obligations that are really limiting my ability to do that. And so, yes, it's been incredibly frustrating. And I also know that everything that's happening right now is for the good of my spiritual path. There is something that is really going to, as you were talking about Saturn, setting me up, giving me a foundation for what's coming next. So
Yeah.
I'm very interested to see what happens next too.
Yay. I love it. It's always amazing to have these tools to be able to understand what's happening and to give us a sense of play and a sense of faith of these moments only last for this moment, right? They might be longer moments or shorter moments, but everything passes in time. And so, like
that's one of the things I love about astrology, right? The planets are always moving, right? These energies are always moving, and that's what's happening in our lives too.
Yeah. There's definitely magic to being able to let things flow and to understand that there are things beyond us that we don't understand. And there is some peace in that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go into my chart.
Okay.
I've said this many times before. It's always difficult to talk about your own chart. So I will try to be as objective about it as possible. But basically for me, Leo rules my 4th house. So for Nicole, everything's happening in her 1st house. For me, it's happening in my 4th house. And what the 4th house can symbolize is it can symbolize home life. It can symbolize family. Some people attribute it to parents, either the mother or father or both, or a caregiver. It basically taps into this energy of the part of your life that is not visible to everyone else out in the world. So oftentimes that's why it has to do with your home life, because when you come home, typically the only people who knows what's happening at home is you and whoever you're living with. And typically that's your family, right? And so this new moon happening in my 4th house basically can indicate that there are some new beginnings that are happening within my inner workings. And perhaps the sense of attachment to my identity or my inner security is changing for me, or it's starting a new path. It's beginning a new path. When Leo rules the 4th house, it's a really interesting energy because it's a private life that's mixed with an energy that is very outward. And so it'll be interesting to see how shifts happen for me. And also, talking about the Venus retrograde that's happening in Leo, how my inner workings are really shifting and redefining and will probably be very visible in my life in some ways. So, yeah. Were you about to add something there?
Oh, well, I was trying to remember what is the sign for your 4th house?
So the sign is Leo. So that's why everything's happening in my 4th house.
Yeah, okay, great.
Exactly. And the only planets that I have there are Lilith, which is not something that we've brought up within our sessions, but I could go more into that at some point. So the aspects that are being made during this time for me is, so for Nicole, it was squaring her Saturn. For me, it's actually trining my own Saturn. And so we still have the world card that Nicole's going to bring in and talk about. But what's happening is the types of conversations that the Saturn and the moon are having. So how I was describing this earlier was it's basically like the path, the path of growth that's happening. So because Nicole's path is a square, which can be very tense, the Saturn might be imposing challenges that are, the path might look super rocky. She might have to traverse a stream, a river, a fast moving river to get to the other side. She might have to climb that mountain to get to the other side of this growth. Whereas the trine for me could look like a much wider level path, might not be such a steep grade that's happening, but I understand that Saturn's energy is still guiding me with a level of foundation. Same as for Nicole, but the path just looks maybe a little bit easier to walk, right? And so that's basically how we're starting to bring in some of these differences of the aspects. So even though Nicole's going to talk about the world card, it is a slightly different relationship with the world card.
Right.
Do you want to go into that right now?
Yeah, I'll just talk about it a little bit. I mean, it's the outcome is the same. It's like, as you were saying, the path is just a little bit different. So again, the world is all about understanding our limitations and how to work within those limitations to become more of who we are. Because it was squaring me, it was a much more challenging, it was more frustrating to find out what those limitations are. Whereas because it's trining you, it's actually supporting you becoming who you are. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. It might feel a little bit more like a fight for you. Whereas for me, it might feel a little bit more like a push up my bum. From my bum to like go up the hill. So, and ultimately, like they're trying to accomplish the same thing. And truly, I think that Saturn does its best work when it has squares, when it has a little bit more of that tension, because Saturn really forces you to slow down and assess. And when you have those limitations or those boundaries are really firm, you have to pay attention to them. You have to work through them so that by the time you reach the other side, there's more of a sense of long-lasting change. And so I think Saturn really feels most effective when it has the square. That's my own personal opinion. That's how I like to work through a lot of that energy. And sometimes you have to question, like, why am I struggling through this? Like, what do I really need to pay attention to during this time? You know?
I love that. I think that's so interesting. And I think you're right on about this whole idea of like, if we're struggling, if we're feeling a sense of struggle and resistance, it's really pointing to something that typically needs to be let go or rethought or reviewed. So yeah, I love that. Very interesting.
Or sometimes there might be things that you can't even see or predict. You know, maybe you're slowing down because the timing of something is not aligned right now. And you might not even really know that. And so it's just really interesting how the universe works, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So, and then the last thing that I want to talk about is this new moon is also making a square to my ascendant, my rising sign. And like I talked about before for Nicole, it's interesting because we have some parallels that are happening within our charts. Everything's happening in her first house, which is her rising, her ascendant. And for me, it's making a square with that for me personally. And so it's activating that for me still. It's activating my Taurus rising sign. And so there is a sense of self-identity that's being refined here. There is a new emergence that's happening out of here in terms of what I attach myself to and how others view me as well. And so really leaning into the idea that any shifts that are happening right now is in the end to have a sense of complete and because it's a square, there's going to be a lot of tension too. Of really redefining a lot of things and leaning into that Saturn too. Like, how are we redefining things for ourselves? Definition is a very Saturnian energy. How are we creating different containers for ourselves? And how are we really carving a path that looks different than how we previously envisioned for ourselves, right?
Yeah, that's so interesting. So Taurus is represented by the Hierophant, which is a really interesting card. I will just admit personally, I have struggled with understanding this card, but it's really about a card of reclamation, reclaiming the parts of yourself that you've disowned in the process of being indoctrinated into our culture. So it's a big energy. And so it's, there are, when we're growing up, we're taught, okay, you're supposed to behave a certain way, you're supposed to act a certain way. But that may not feel natural to you. So the Hierophant shows up when we are learning how to reclaim those parts of ourselves that are more honest to who we are, to who we really are. So maybe you have disowned, for instance, being a really, maybe you've quieted yourself. Maybe you're much louder and people have always told you to, be quieter. But the Hierophant is about reclaiming your voice in that particular scenario, or, just reclaiming a part of you that you have had to shut down or hide away because for whatever reason, someone in culture or even in your family culture has told you that that's not acceptable. So because it's in that square position, there may be some resistance here to reclaiming that part of you, because it can be really scary to reclaim those parts that we've disowned. We believe that's what kept us safe. It makes us feel like we belong and we're loved and valued. So sometimes reclaiming those parts of ourselves can be a really scary process.
Yeah, that really speaks to me, Nicole. I think during this period in my life, really calling back your power, right? And this feeds into this idea of Leo, of strength also. And there's a sense of shedding also that I'm hearing that's happening, of really being able to really figure out like who you are at the core, who I am at the core, and how can I let that shine. And I really love that. Thank you so much, Nicole.
Oh, you're so welcome.
Okay, that was a nice long session. So we really went in depth with the Leo. We went in depth with all of the aspects and our charts and rituals and all that good stuff. Nicole, are there any last words that you'd like to leave us with?
I don't think so. Just enjoy this new moon energy and looking at the strength you have, the inner power that you have, because you work with your heart and you have integrated your wild side. You listen to it. You're not dominating it. So you don't have to be the nice person all the time. You can listen to your wilder instincts, but know how to integrate them in a more constructive way.
I love that.
How about you?
All right, everyone. Oh, me. I got to say something too. No, I think for me, what's really coming through is how do you move out of your own way to let yourself shine,
Wow,
and I think that that's really tapping into the heart of Leo rather than the facade of Leo, rather than the armor of the ego. And so that's what's really coming in for me. So, yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Thanks for asking me, Nicole.
Yeah, of course. And I just want to add, if anyone is interested in understanding how some of these different planetary aspects or movements are affecting your chart, let us know. We'd be happy to chat with you.
Yeah, we love just digging into everyone's energies and getting really nerdy about it and really understanding everyone and helping people understand themselves. I think there's so much satisfaction and love in that. So
yeah, and
don't hesitate to reach out.
Right, I find it's very validating. It's usually validating things that are very deep within us that we kind of know, but we're not really sure. And so it really helps to allow us to access our depths and trust in our depths a little bit more when we do this work.
Yeah, there is something really powerful about when a stranger tells you things and affirms things that you've kind of always felt, but never had the language or never had someone else mirror it back to you. And so it's a very, it's a process where you can feel very seen. There's a lot of revelation that happens within this. So yeah, it can be deeply moving and transformative for sure. Yeah. Okay. I think we are good for new moon in Leo. Everyone out there, make sure that you live with a fierceness, with a wildness, with really tapping into what your heart really wants during this time.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you guys. We'll see you next month.
Bye.